In the high-stakes world of aviation, where every decision can mean the difference between life and death, there lies an unspoken hierarchy that governs the skies. But today, that hierarchy will be challenged in a way no one could have predicted. It starts with a simple boarding call, a routine flight set to take off from one bustling city to another. But what happens next will expose the ugly undercurrents of racism that often go unnoticed in the most unexpected places. This isn't just a story about a pilot and a passenger. It's a story about the invisible lines drawn by society, lines that separate who gets to belong and who doesn't. As the pilot, a man who has always been in control, faces a choice that will reveal his true character. We're about to witness a confrontation that will not only shake the cabin, but also the very foundations of what we consider right and wrong. As the tension builds and the stakes become clearer, you'll find yourself questioning the power dynamics at play in even the most mundane of settings. Because when a man in uniform abuses his authority and another man challenges that abuse with quiet dignity, the resulting clash is one that will leave you reeling. Stick around because the revelation that follows will not only change the course of this flight, but could change the way you see the world around you. This isn't just another journey. It's a flight into the heart of prejudice, where the destination is a truth many are too afraid to confront. The sun had just begun its descent, casting a golden hue over the tarmac as Captain Robert McAllister strode towards the cockpit of the Boeing 747. He was a man of discipline, precision, and above all, control, a figure as stern and immovable as the towering clouds he often navigated through. Today, however, there was a tightness in his chest, a discomfort he couldn't quite shake off. It wasn't the routine pre-flight jitters that sometimes flickered in his nerves before a long-haul flight. No, this was something else entirely. "It's him," Robert thought as he caught sight of the black passenger at the gate. A chill ran down his spine, not from fear, but from a deep-seated, irrational loathing. The kind of loathing that had been cultivated over decades, nurtured by his upbringing, and reinforced by the culture of superiority he had been steeped in since childhood. As he watched the man approach the boarding area, Robert's mind wandered back to the days of his youth. His high school, a prestigious, predominantly white institution, had been his kingdom, and he its tyrant. He remembered the way his gang of like-minded friends had terrorized the few black students who dared to enroll. They were outcasts, and Robert had made sure they knew it. He could still hear the taunts, the jeers, the laughter as he and his friends cornered a black boy in the hallway, a small figure against their towering presence. The boy's dark eyes, filled with a mix of fear and defiance, had only fueled Robert's cruelty. "You don't belong here," Robert had sneered, his voice dripping with venom, each word a dagger meant to wound. That boy had transferred schools shortly after, unable to withstand the relentless barrage of bullying. Robert had felt no remorse. In fact, he had felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. That mindset hadn't left him, even as he donned the polished uniform of a commercial airline pilot. If anything, it had solidified, crystallized into an unshakable belief system. He viewed himself as superior, not just because of his position, but because of his race. To him, the world was divided into those who belonged and those who didn't, and he was the gatekeeper of that divide. Robert's disdain for black people was not just a remnant of his youth. It was a living, breathing force that guided his every decision. It was why he refused to attend seminars in Africa or in any predominantly black countries. The idea of setting foot on what he considered their soil was repugnant to him. He'd scoff at the mere suggestion, dismissing it with a wave of his hand. "I'm not wasting my time there," he would say to his colleagues, his tone icy and resolute. "They can keep their struggles, their histories. It has nothing to do with me." Inside the cockpit, Robert settled into his seat, adjusting the controls with the precision of a maestro preparing for a symphony. The co-pilot, a young, eager man with years ahead of him, looked up, sensing the tension. "Everything all right, Captain?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. Robert forced a tight smile. "Everything's fine, just another day in the sky." But everything wasn't fine. Not for Robert. The presence of that passenger gnawed at him, an irritant that he couldn't ignore. His mind raced, each thought darker than the last. Why do they have to be everywhere? He mused, his thoughts veering into the realm of the irrational. Always demanding, always expecting things they don't deserve. As passengers began to board, Robert's eyes were drawn again to the black man. He watched him like a hawk, his gaze hard and unforgiving. The man seemed unaware of the scrutiny, carrying himself with a quiet dignity that only served to irritate Robert further. He noticed the man's crisp suit, the polished shoes, the way he held his head high. It was infuriating. Who does he think he is? Robert thought bitterly, the words forming a sour taste in his mouth. The moment the man stepped onto the plane, Robert felt his grip on control start to slip. It was as if the mere presence of this passenger was a direct challenge to his authority, to everything he believed in. Not on my flight, he thought, a scowl forming on his face. Not on my watch. It was then that Robert made a decision born out of years of ingrained prejudice and unchecked power. He reached for the intercom, his fingers trembling slightly as he pressed the button. The voice that came out was cold, mechanical, devoid of the warmth usually reserved for passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Unfortunately, due to a sudden operational issue, we will have to delay this flight momentarily. We ask that all passengers remain seated while we resolve the matter. Thank you for your understanding. He knew it was a lie. There was no operational issue. The only issue was the one seated in first class, the black passenger who Robert had already decided would not be flying on his plane today. He glanced at the co-pilot, who was too inexperienced to question the decision. To him, Robert's word was law, and that suited Robert just fine. With a calculated move, Robert stood and left the cockpit, his stride purposeful. He approached the first-class cabin, his eyes locking onto the passenger. The man looked up, meeting Robert's gaze with a calm that only served to infuriate him further. "Is there a problem, Captain?" the man asked, his voice steady. Robert didn't answer immediately. He let the silence hang, heavy and oppressive, a silent power play. Finally he spoke, his voice dripping with the authority he wielded so effortlessly. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to disembark from this plane." A ripple of shock went through the first-class cabin. Passengers exchanged confused glances, whispers of disbelief spreading like wildfire. The black man's expression remained neutral, though Robert noticed a flicker of something, perhaps anger, perhaps something else, in his eyes. "May I ask why?" the man inquired, his tone still calm. Robert's mouth curled into a smirk, though there was no humor in it. "I don't have to explain myself to you. Please, gather your belongings and leave." The man didn't move immediately. For a moment, Robert thought he might resist, and the thought thrilled him. He almost wanted it, craved the confrontation, the chance to assert his dominance. But then the man stood, his movements deliberate and controlled. He reached for his briefcase, his eyes never leaving Robert's. "I'll be making a phone call," the man said quietly, and there was a warning in his tone, a promise of repercussions. Robert didn't care. He watched with satisfaction as the man walked down the aisle, the other passengers watching in stunned silence. As the man disappeared from view, Robert felt a surge of triumph. He had won. He had upheld the order of things, kept the divide intact. But as Robert returned to the cockpit, a small, unsettling thought began to creep into his mind. He pushed it aside, dismissing it as paranoia. What could he possibly do? He thought. I'm the captain. I make the rules here. Yet the thought lingered, a shadow at the edge of his mind. He could still feel the weight of the black man's gaze, the unspoken challenge in his parting words. It was a challenge Robert wasn't used to, and it left him with an unease he couldn't quite shake. Little did he know that phone call would set off a chain of events that would shake the very foundation of his beliefs, and the outcome would be something he could never have anticipated. Captain Robert McAllister returned to the cockpit, the echo of the black passenger's parting words lingering in his mind like a distant thunderstorm, low and rumbling. He shook it off, telling himself it was nothing, just the idle threat of a man who didn't know his place. He had done his duty, maintained the order he believed in. But as he adjusted his headset and prepared for takeoff, there was a subtle tension in his movements, a tightness in his chest that he couldn't quite explain. The plane's engines hummed to life, the sound a comforting reminder of the control he had over the situation. Robert took a deep breath, trying to focus on the task at hand. He'd flown this route 100 times before, and today would be no different. But even as he went through the familiar motions, his thoughts kept drifting back to the man he had just removed from the plane. Who was he, really? Robert wondered. And what kind of phone call could he possibly make that would affect me? He almost scoffed at the idea. Probably some empty threat. But then, why couldn't he shake the feeling that something was off? As the plane taxied down the runway, Robert's thoughts were interrupted by a soft chime. It was the intercom, signaling a message from the flight attendants. He pressed the button to listen, expecting the usual updates. But instead, the voice that crackled through was tinged with concern. "Captain, we've just received a message from the ground crew. There's been a request for an immediate return to the gate. They said it's urgent." Robert frowned. Urgent? He couldn't think of anything more urgent than getting this plane in the air and on its way. Annoyed, he glanced at the co-pilot, who looked just as puzzled. "Did they say why?" Robert asked, trying to keep the irritation out of his voice. "No, sir. Just that it's from the airline's headquarters." Headquarters? The word sent a shiver down Robert's spine. What could they possibly want? He was in charge up here. Not them. He made the decisions. Not some desk jockey miles away. Still, protocol dictated that he comply with such requests. With a sigh, he flipped the intercom switch and addressed the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've just received a request to return to the gate for an urgent matter. We apologize for the delay and will update you as soon as we have more information." He could almost feel the collective groan of the passengers, though he couldn't care less. This was just another inconvenience, a blip in what was supposed to be a routine flight. But as the plane turned back towards the gate, Robert couldn't help but feel a growing unease. When the plane finally came to a stop, Robert unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. He didn't bother masking his frustration as he exited the cockpit and headed down the aisle, the curious eyes of passengers following him as he went. He ignored them, his mind already racing with possibilities of what this interruption could be. As he stepped off the plane, he was met by a stern-faced ground crew member holding a tablet. "Captain McAllister, there's a video call waiting for you in the terminal," the crew member said, his tone respectful but firm. "A video call?" Robert repeated, his frown deepening. This was getting stranger by the minute. "From who?" "From the CEO, sir." Those words hit Robert like a jolt of electricity. The CEO? What on earth could the CEO want with me? "Right this way, sir," the ground crew member said, gesturing towards a small office near the gate. Robert's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts as he followed, his steps quickening. The CEO? Why would he be involved? The unease that had been gnawing at him since he removed the black passenger was now a full-blown storm in his chest. The office was small and sparse, with a simple desk and chair facing a large screen. The crew member handed Robert the tablet and then stepped out, closing the door behind him. Robert sat down, his hands gripping the tablet tightly as the screen flickered to life. The image that appeared was that of a middle-aged man with graying hair, sharp features, and a no-nonsense expression. Robert recognized him instantly, James Thornton, the CEO of the airline. A man known for his business acumen and, more importantly, his unwavering commitment to customer satisfaction. "Captain McAllister," Thornton began, his voice cool and measured, "I trust you know why I'm contacting you." Robert swallowed hard. I'm not entirely sure, sir." Thornton's gaze was piercing, and Robert suddenly felt like a schoolboy being reprimanded by the headmaster. "Let me clarify then. We've received a very disturbing report about your conduct on this flight." Robert's heart skipped a beat. He opened his mouth to speak, but Thornton continued, cutting him off. "You removed a passenger from the flight without cause. A passenger who has every right to be there." "Sir, Robert began, but Thornton's glare silenced him. "The passenger you removed is a valued customer. More importantly, he's a person who has been subjected to discrimination, and I will not tolerate such behavior from anyone under my command." The words hit Robert like a ton of bricks. "Discrimination?" He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. "Sir, I didn't..." I'm not interested in your excuses, Captain, Thornton interrupted, his voice hard as steel. This isn't the first time we've received complaints about your conduct, though I had hoped those reports were exaggerated. Clearly, I was mistaken. Robert felt the ground beneath him start to crumble. Complaints? What complaints? He had always been careful, always made sure his decisions were justified, at least in his own mind. But now it seemed those decisions were coming back to haunt him. Thornton leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Captain, the passenger you removed happens to be a very influential individual. His removal from this flight has already sparked a significant backlash, and I've been fielding calls from our partners, our board members, and even from the media. This situation has escalated far beyond your control. Robert's mind raced, his thoughts colliding in a chaotic mess. Influential? Media? He hadn't considered that this man could be anyone of importance. To him, he was just another passenger, another black man who didn't belong. Thornton's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. Captain, I've instructed the ground crew to bring the passenger back on board. You will personally apologize to him and ensure that he is treated with the utmost respect for the remainder of this flight. Robert's stomach twisted into knots. Apologize? To that man? The very thought made his blood boil. He had never apologized to anyone like that in his life, and the idea of doing so now felt like a betrayal of everything he believed in. But Thornton wasn't finished. And after this flight, you and I are going to have a long conversation about your future with this airline. Understand this, Captain. There is no place for prejudice in this company. If you cannot adhere to our standards, then you will find yourself grounded permanently. The threat hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Robert knew what that meant. He had worked too hard, climbed too high, to let it all come crashing down now. But as much as he wanted to fight back, to argue his case, he knew it would be futile. Thornton was the final word, and his word was law. I understand, sir, Robert said, his voice barely above a whisper. Good, Thornton replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. Now get back on that plane and do your job. The screen went dark, leaving Robert staring at his own reflection. The lines of tension etched deep into his face. He felt like he was drowning, the weight of the conversation pulling him under. He had been so sure, so confident in his actions. But now everything was unraveling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. For a moment, he just sat there, frozen in place. The anger simmered in his chest, a volatile mix of frustration and helplessness. This isn't fair, he thought bitterly. I did nothing wrong. But deep down, a small voice whispered otherwise, a voice he had long since silenced with his own beliefs. It was the voice of reason, the voice that told him what he had done was not just wrong, but unforgivable. He had let his prejudices dictate his actions, and now he was paying the price. Reluctantly, Robert stood and made his way back to the plane. The walk felt longer this time, each step weighed down by the knowledge of what he had to do. When he boarded the plane, he could feel the eyes of the passengers on him, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. He ignored them, focusing only on the task ahead. He had to find that passenger, had to apologize, had to make things right. But as he approached the first-class cabin, he couldn't help but feel a surge of resentment. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. He was the captain, the one in charge, and yet here he was, being forced to bow to someone else's demands. When he reached the passenger's seat, he found the man already there, seated with the same calm demeanor as before. The flight attendants had clearly informed him of the situation, and he watched Robert approach with an air of quiet authority. Sir, Robert began, his voice strained, I want to apologize for my earlier actions. I was wrong to ask you to leave, and I deeply regret any discomfort I may have caused. The words tasted like ash in his mouth, and he had to force himself to keep his tone even. The passenger regarded him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Apology accepted, the man replied, though there was no warmth in his voice. He glanced at Robert as if searching for something, then nodded slightly. Thank you, Captain. Robert wanted to be done with it, to return to the cockpit and put this entire ordeal behind him. But as he turned to leave, the man spoke again, stopping him in his tracks. Captain, the man said, his tone firm but not unkind, I hope this incident has given you something to think about. We all make mistakes, but it's how we learn from them that defines who we are. Robert stiffened at the words, a part of him bristling at the suggestion that he needed to learn anything from this man. But another part of him, the part he had buried deep under layers of arrogance and prejudice, couldn't help but recognize the truth in those words. Without replying, Robert nodded curtly and returned to the cockpit. He could feel the eyes of the passengers on him as he walked away, the weight of their judgment pressing down on him like a physical force. Back in his seat, Robert stared at the controls, his hands gripping the yoke tightly. The plane was ready for takeoff, and all he had to do was give the signal. But his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, the events of the past hour playing over and over in his head. Why should I care what he thinks? Robert thought bitterly. I'm the captain. I've earned my place here. No one can take that away from me. But even as he tried to reassure himself, he couldn't shake the nagging doubt that had taken root in his mind. Thornton's words echoed in his ears, a constant reminder that his actions had consequences, consequences that he hadn't fully considered. Finally, with a deep breath, Robert flipped the intercom switch and spoke. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We apologize for the delay. We are now ready for takeoff. Please ensure that your seatbelts are fastened and prepare for departure. The plane began to move, rolling slowly towards the runway. As it picked up speed, Robert focused on the task at hand, forcing himself to block out everything else. But even as the plane lifted off the ground, soaring into the sky, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had lost something important, something that he might never get back. The flight continued in silence, the hum of the engines the only sound as the plane climbed higher and higher. But for Robert, the journey was far from over. The real battle was just beginning, a battle not with the passenger or the CEO, but with himself and the beliefs that had shaped him for so long. And deep down, he knew that this was a battle he couldn't afford to lose. Before we dive into what comes next for Robert, I want to take a moment to speak directly to you. Yes, you. If you've made it this far, it means you're just as invested in this journey as we are. And for that, we want to say thank you. Stories like Robert's aren't always easy to tell, but they're necessary. They force us to confront uncomfortable truths, to challenge our own perspectives, and to grow from the experiences of others. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think or feel something new, then we'd love for you to join our community. By subscribing, you ensure that you'll never miss another powerful narrative, another moment of truth that has the potential to inspire real change, not just in the characters we explore, but in our own lives as well. We're on a journey together, one that's filled with stories of redemption, justice, and personal growth. And the best part? You get to be a part of that journey. By hitting the notification bell, you'll be the first to know when a new story is ready to unfold. You'll be right there with us as we dive into the complexities of human nature, uncovering the layers of our shared experiences. But subscribing isn't just about staying informed. It's about joining a community of like-minded individuals who value these stories as much as you do. It's about being part of a conversation that challenges the status quo, that asks the tough questions, and that seeks out the truth, no matter how difficult it may be. We understand that your time is valuable, and we don't take your support lightly. Every time you click that subscribe button, you're not just signing up for more content. You're supporting the creation of stories that matter, stories that have the power to change minds and hearts. So if you haven't already, take a moment to subscribe. Hit that notification bell to ensure you're always in the loop. We promise to keep bringing you stories that are not only engaging and thought-provoking, but also deeply human. Stories that explore the full spectrum of life's experiences, from the lightest joys to the darkest struggles. And remember, this isn't just about watching a video. This is about being part of something bigger, a movement towards understanding, empathy, and positive change. We're thrilled to have you with us on this journey, and we can't wait to share more with you. Thank you for your support, for your engagement, and for your willingness to explore these stories with us. Together, we can keep pushing the boundaries of storytelling, making sure that every narrative we share has the potential to make a difference. Now, let's get back to Robert's journey, because as you'll see, his story is far from over. As the plane soared through the skies, Captain Robert McAllister sat rigid in his seat, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't seem to escape. The steady hum of the engines, once a source of comfort and control, now seemed to echo the turmoil brewing inside him. The words of the passenger he had wronged, and more so, those of CEO James Thornton, replayed in his mind like a broken record. Robert's hands clenched around the yoke, his knuckles white against the dark material. He had always prided himself on being in control of his aircraft, his crew, and his life. But now, for the first time in years, he felt that control slipping away, like sand through his fingers. The doubt that had crept into his mind earlier was growing, spreading like a dark stain, impossible to ignore. The flight continued smoothly, the autopilot engaged as the plane leveled off at cruising altitude. Yet the calm exterior of the flight belied the storm that was raging within Robert. He tried to focus on the instruments, on the routine checks and adjustments that normally occupied his attention during long flights. But his thoughts kept drifting back, against his will, to the man in first class, and the events that had led up to this moment. How could things have gone so wrong, he wondered. What was it about that man that rattled me so much? He knew the answer, of course. It was the same answer that had haunted him since his school days, the same answer that had shaped his views on the world. But now, for the first time, he found himself questioning those views, questioning the beliefs that had been instilled in him from a young age. Robert had grown up in a household where the lines were clearly drawn, where people were judged not by their character, but by the color of their skin. His father, a stern man who had served in the military, had always made it clear that there were certain people who were to be respected and others who were not. And those who were not, well, they were to be treated accordingly. As a child, Robert had absorbed these lessons without question. He had watched as his father dismissed people of color, spoke down to them, and treated them as if they were somehow less deserving of dignity. And Robert, wanting nothing more than to earn his father's approval, had followed in his footsteps. In school, he had taken those lessons to heart, becoming the bully who tormented those who were different, those who didn't fit into his narrow view of the world. He had seen it as a game, a way to assert his dominance, to prove to himself and to others that he was superior. And it had worked, at least for a time. But now, sitting in the cockpit of a multi-million-dollar aircraft, with the weight of his actions pressing down on him like never before, Robert couldn't help but wonder if he had been wrong all along. If the things he had been taught, the things he had believed for so long, were nothing more than a web of lies. He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. This was no time for introspection, no time to be second-guessing himself. He had a job to do, and he needed to stay focused. But the doubt, once seated, had taken root, and it refused to let go. Suddenly, the intercom crackled to life, jolting Robert from his thoughts. It was the lead flight attendant, her voice calm but tinged with concern. "Captain, we have a situation in first class." Robert's heart skipped a beat. What now? He had hoped that once the plane was in the air, the tension would ease, and the flight would proceed without further incident. But it seemed that was not to be. "What's the situation?" Robert asked, his voice betraying his anxiety. "There's a passenger who's feeling unwell," the attendant replied. "He's complaining of chest pain and difficulty breathing." Robert's stomach dropped. A medical emergency was the last thing he needed right now, but as the captain, it was his responsibility to handle it. "Is it the same passenger?" Robert asked, though he already knew the answer. "Yes, Captain," the attendant confirmed. "It's the gentleman you spoke to earlier." Robert closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. Of course it's him, he thought grimly. This flight was turning into a nightmare, and there seemed to be no end in sight. "I'll be right there," Robert said, his voice steadier than he felt. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood, pausing for a moment to collect himself. Then, with a deep breath, he left the cockpit and made his way down the aisle. As he approached the first-class cabin, he could feel the eyes of the passengers on him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. He ignored them, focusing on the task at hand. When he reached the passenger seat, he found the man slumped over, his face pale and sweaty. A flight attendant was kneeling beside him, trying to comfort him. "Sir," Robert said, his voice firm but gentle, "I understand you're not feeling well. Can you tell me what's going on?" The man looked up, his eyes filled with pain. "It's my chest," he gasped. "It feels like there's a weight pressing down on me. I can't breathe." Robert felt a surge of panic. This was serious. He turned to the flight attendant. "We need to get him some oxygen and call for medical assistance. Now." The attendant nodded and hurried off to get the oxygen tank. Robert knelt beside the passenger, trying to stay calm. "Just take slow, deep breaths," he said, though he wasn't sure if it was more for the passenger's benefit or his own. As the minutes ticked by, Robert couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. What if something happens to him, he thought. What if he doesn't make it? The thought was terrifying, not just because of the implications for the flight, but because of what it would mean for Robert personally. If this man died on his flight, it would be a scandal of epic proportions, and Robert knew that he would be the one to take the fall. Finally, the flight attendant returned with the oxygen tank, and Robert helped her place the mask over the man's face. The passenger took a few deep breaths, his chest rising and falling as the oxygen began to take effect. Slowly, the color returned to his face, and his breathing became less labored. Robert let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Crisis averted, at least for now, he thought. But the relief was short-lived as the implications of what had just happened began to sink in. This was more than just a medical emergency. It was a reminder of the fragile nature of life and of the consequences of his actions. If this man had died, it would have been on Robert's conscience, a burden he wasn't sure he could bear. As the passenger stabilized, Robert stood and stepped back, his mind racing. He needed to talk to the co-pilot, to figure out their next steps. Should they continue to their destination, or should they turn back and seek medical help on the ground? Before he could make a decision, the intercom crackled to life once again. This time, it was a different voice, one that Robert didn't recognize. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your CEO speaking." The words sent a shockwave through the cabin. The passengers, already on edge from the earlier events, now looked around in confusion and surprise. Robert felt his heart skip a beat. What is Thornton doing? He wondered, his mind reeling. "I wanted to personally address you all," Thornton continued, his tone calm but authoritative, "regarding the situation that has unfolded on this flight. It has come to my attention that one of our passengers was treated unfairly and was nearly removed from this flight without just cause. This is unacceptable and goes against everything we stand for as a company." Robert felt his blood run cold. This was it. Thornton was about to throw him under the bus in front of the entire plane. He could already see his career unraveling before his eyes, the years of hard work and dedication crumbling to dust. "I want to assure you all," Thornton said, "that we take incidents of discrimination very seriously. The passenger in question is a valued member of our community, and we will not tolerate any behavior that undermines their dignity and rights." Robert felt a wave of nausea wash over him. This can't be happening, he thought desperately. Not like this. "And to that passenger," Thornton continued, his voice softening, "I want to extend my deepest apologies on behalf of the entire airline. You deserve better, and we will do everything in our power to make this right." There was a pause, and Robert could almost feel the collective breath of the passengers as they waited for what would come next. "As for the individual responsible," Thornton said, his tone hardening once more, "they will be held accountable for their actions. We do not tolerate discrimination in any form, and those who engage in such behavior will face the consequences." Robert's heart pounded in his chest. This is it. It's over. But then Thornton's tone shifted again, taking on a more conciliatory note. "However, we also believe in the power of redemption and learning from our mistakes. We will be providing additional training and resources to ensure that this kind of incident does not happen again." Robert blinked in surprise. Training? Was Thornton really giving him a second chance? After everything that had happened, after all the damage he had caused, could he really walk away from this with just a slap on the wrist? It didn't seem possible, but as the intercom fell silent, Robert realized that Thornton was offering him a lifeline, a chance to salvage what remained of his career. It wasn't forgiveness, not by a long shot, but it was something. It was hope. Robert took a deep breath, feeling the weight on his chest begin to lift. He wasn't out of the woods yet, but at least he had a path forward. however narrow it might be. He returned to the cockpit, his mind still reeling from the events of the past few minutes. The co-pilot looked up as he entered, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. "Captain, what just happened?" he asked. Robert shook his head. "I'm not entirely sure," he admitted, "but it looks like we're not turning back. Let's focus on getting this plane to its destination." The co-pilot nodded, though he still seemed unsettled by the situation. Robert couldn't blame him. This wasn't the kind of flight they had trained for, and it certainly wasn't the kind of flight Robert had ever expected to experience. As the plane continued on its course, Robert tried to push the events out of his mind, focusing instead on the task at hand. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, that the real challenges were yet to come. The hours passed slowly, each minute dragging on as Robert fought to maintain his composure. The plane had reached cruising altitude, and the flight was progressing smoothly. But the tension in the cockpit was palpable, a thick, suffocating presence that hung over everything. Robert's mind kept drifting back to the man in first class, the passenger he had so casually dismissed. What kind of life had he led? What struggles had he faced to get to this point, only to be confronted with Robert's prejudice and arrogance? It was a question Robert didn't want to answer, but one he couldn't ignore. The man's calm demeanor, his quiet strength, it all spoke of someone who had faced far greater challenges than Robert could ever imagine. And yet Robert had treated him as if he were nothing, as if his very presence was an affront. The more Robert thought about it, the more he realized just how wrong he had been. This wasn't about the passenger or even about the flight. This was about Robert, about the beliefs he had clung to for so long, beliefs that had blinded him to the humanity of others. He thought back to his father, to the lessons he had learned at a young age. His father had been a hard man, stern and unyielding, with little patience for weakness or dissent. Robert had idolized him, had wanted nothing more than to earn his approval. But now, for the first time, Robert began to see his father in a different light. His father's beliefs, the prejudices that had been passed down from generation to generation, were not born out of strength, but out of fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of losing control, fear of being less than. And Robert, in his desperation to prove himself, had adopted those beliefs without question. But now, faced with the consequences of those beliefs, Robert began to see them for what they truly were: a crutch, a way to avoid facing the complexities of the world, a way to maintain the illusion of superiority. And in doing so, he had hurt others, had caused pain and suffering, all to protect his fragile sense of self. The realization hit Robert like a tidal wave, washing over him with a force that left him breathless. He had been wrong, so very wrong, and now he had to face the consequences. But even as the weight of his mistakes pressed down on him, Robert felt a flicker of something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time. It was the faintest glimmer of hope, the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he could change, that he could learn from this, that he could become a better person, a better pilot, a better human being. The thought terrified him, but it also gave him a sense of purpose, a reason to keep going. He wasn't sure how he would do it, or if he even could, but he knew that he had to try. He owed it to himself, and more importantly, he owed it to those he had wronged. The rest of the flight passed in a blur, Robert's mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. When they finally touched down at their destination, he felt a sense of relief, but also a sense of dread. This was just the beginning, and he knew that the hardest part was yet to come. As the plane taxied to the gate, Robert took a deep breath, preparing himself for what he had to do next. He had to face the passenger, had to offer more than just an apology. He had to make things right, even if it meant confronting the very beliefs that had shaped him for so long. When the plane came to a stop, Robert stood and straightened his uniform. He glanced at the co-pilot, who gave him a nod of encouragement. With a final deep breath, Robert left the cockpit and made his way down the aisle. The passengers were disembarking, and Robert waited near the exit, his heart pounding in his chest. When the black passenger approached, Robert stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly. "Sir," Robert began, his voice low and sincere, "I want to speak with you, if you'll allow me." The man looked at Robert, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Robert feared he would refuse, that he would walk away without a word. But then the man nodded, and Robert felt a surge of relief. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Robert continued, his voice steadying as he spoke, "and I realize now that what I did was not just wrong, it was inexcusable. I let my own prejudices cloud my judgment, and for that I am deeply sorry." The man said nothing, but his eyes softened slightly, and Robert took that as a sign to continue. "I know that an apology isn't enough," Robert said, his voice filled with emotion, "but I want you to know that I am committed to changing, to being better, and I want to thank you for opening my eyes to the truth." The man regarded Robert for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Then he extended his hand. "I accept your apology, Captain," the man said, his voice calm and measured, "and I hope you do take this as an opportunity to grow. We all have our faults, but it's how we choose to address them that defines us." Robert took the man's hand, feeling a sense of gratitude that was almost overwhelming. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for giving me this chance." The man nodded and then turned to leave, his steps measured and dignified. Robert watched him go, feeling a mix of relief and determination. This wasn't the end, but it was a start, a new beginning. As Robert returned to the cockpit to gather his things, he couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him to this point. It had been a long and difficult road, filled with mistakes and regrets, but also with moments of clarity and growth. He knew that he had a long way to go, that there were still challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face them. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he was determined to make the most of it, to be the best version of himself that he could be. As Robert McAllister walked through the terminal, the weight of the recent events still pressed heavily on his shoulders, but now there was a flicker of determination, a resolve to face the consequences of his actions head-on. The echoes of his footsteps were drowned out by the buzz of the airport, passengers hurrying to their gates, announcements blaring overhead, and the distant roar of jet engines. It was a world that had always been his domain, a place where he was in control, but now it felt different, as if he were seeing it through new eyes. Robert's thoughts were interrupted by the vibration of his phone in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a notification from the airline's internal messaging system. An urgent meeting with CEO James Thornton had been scheduled for the following morning. The message was brief and to the point, offering no details other than the time and location. "This is it," Robert thought, his heart pounding in his chest. "This is where I'll find out what happens next." The rest of the day passed in a blur as Robert went through the motions of his duties, mechanically handling the paperwork, debriefing the crew, and ensuring that everything was in order for the next flight. But his mind was elsewhere, consumed by the looming meeting and the uncertainty of his future. Every time he thought about it, a knot formed in his stomach, tightening with each passing hour. That night, sleep eluded him. He tossed and turned in bed, his thoughts racing. He replayed the events of the flight over and over in his mind, searching for some way to make sense of it all, to reconcile his past actions with the man he wanted to become. But no matter how hard he tried, the same question kept surfacing. Can I really change? Morning came too soon, and Robert found himself standing in front of the airline's corporate headquarters, a sleek, glass-fronted building that reflected the bright morning sun. He hesitated for a moment, his nerves frayed, before taking a deep breath and stepping inside. The receptionist greeted him with a polite smile, though Robert couldn't help but feel that she knew why he was there, that she could see right through him. He was directed to a conference room on the top floor, where James Thornton was waiting. As Robert approached the room, he felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. This was the moment of truth, the moment that would determine whether he still had a future with the airline or whether he would be grounded for good. He knocked on the door, and a voice from within called out, "Come in." Robert pushed the door open and stepped inside. The conference room was spacious, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. James Thornton sat at the head of a long polished table, a file folder in front of him. He looked up as Robert entered, his expression unreadable. "Captain McAllister," Thornton said, his tone neutral. "Please, have a seat." Robert nodded and took the chair opposite Thornton, his hands gripping the armrest tightly. For a moment, neither man spoke, the silence in the room stretching out uncomfortably. Robert could feel his pulse quicken, the anticipation nearly unbearable. Finally, Thornton broke the silence. "I'm sure you're aware of why I've called you here today." "Yes, sir," Robert replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "I understand that my actions on the last flight were unacceptable." Thornton nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving Robert's. "Indeed, what happened on that flight was a serious breach of our company's values. We pride ourselves on providing an inclusive and respectful environment for all our passengers, and what you did was in direct violation of that principle." Robert felt a pang of guilt, the weight of his actions settling heavily on his shoulders. He opened his mouth to speak, but Thornton held up a hand to stop him. "Before you say anything, Captain," Thornton said, "I want to make something clear. This is not just about the incident on the flight. We've received numerous complaints about your behavior over the years, complaints that suggest a pattern of conduct that is inconsistent with our values." Robert's heart sank. He had always prided himself on being a professional, on maintaining the highest standards in his work. But now, faced with the reality of his actions, he realized just how far he had fallen short. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this," Thornton continued, his voice firm. "You're on thin ice, Captain. Very thin ice. If it weren't for the fact that you have an otherwise exemplary record as a pilot, I would have no hesitation in recommending your immediate dismissal." The words hit Robert like a punch to the gut. He had known this was coming, but hearing it spoken out loud made it all the more real. He had always thought of himself as untouchable, as someone who was above reproach. But now he saw just how vulnerable he truly was. Thornton leaned back in his chair, his gaze softening slightly. "That being said, I believe in second chances. I believe that people can change, and I'm willing to give you that opportunity. But it's not going to be easy." Robert nodded, a mixture of relief and anxiety flooding through him. "I understand, sir. I'm ready to do whatever it takes." Thornton's expression remained serious. "You'll be required to undergo a comprehensive training program focused on diversity, inclusion, and cultural sensitivity. This isn't just a box-ticking exercise. This is about fundamentally changing the way you think and act." Robert nodded again, absorbing the gravity of the situation. He knew this was more than just a professional requirement. This was a chance to truly confront his past, to unlearn the toxic beliefs that had shaped him for so long. "In addition," Thornton continued, "I want you to personally reach out to the passenger you wronged. A genuine apology, not just for what happened on that flight, but for the attitudes and behaviors that led to it. I think it's important that you take responsibility for your actions, not just as a pilot, but as a human being." Robert swallowed hard. He had already apologized once, but he knew that this time it had to be different. This time, it had to come from a place of true understanding and remorse. "I'll do it," Robert said, his voice quiet but resolute. "I'll reach out to him and make things right." Thornton nodded, satisfied with Robert's response. "Good. I hope you take this seriously, Captain. This is your chance to redeem yourself, both in the eyes of the company and in your own eyes. Don't waste it." With that, Thornton stood, signaling the end of the meeting. Robert followed suit, feeling a mixture of relief and trepidation. As he prepared to leave, Thornton spoke one final time. "Remember, Captain," he said, his voice carrying a note of warning, "this is your last chance. If there's even a hint of the behavior we've seen in the past, you won't get another opportunity. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Robert replied, his voice firm. "I understand." Thornton nodded, and with that, Robert left the conference room. As he walked down the hallway, his mind was a whirl of thoughts and emotions. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that he would have to confront parts of himself that he had long ignored. But for the first time, he felt ready to take that journey, to do the hard work of changing himself for the better. The following weeks were some of the most challenging of Robert's life. The training program was intense, forcing him to confront the biases and prejudices that had been ingrained in him since childhood. The sessions were led by experts in diversity and inclusion, people who had spent their careers fighting against the very attitudes that Robert had held for so long. At first, Robert found the process uncomfortable, even painful. It was like peeling back layers of himself that he hadn't even known existed. exposing the raw, unexamined beliefs that had shaped his worldview. There were moments when he wanted to quit, to walk away from it all and retreat back into the safety of his old life. But each time, he reminded himself of the promise he had made, to Thornton, to the passenger, and to himself. The training was more than just lectures and readings. It involved active participation, role-playing scenarios, and group discussions. Robert found himself face-to-face with people from all walks of life, hearing their stories, their struggles, and their triumphs. It was eye-opening, to say the least. He listened as his fellow participants shared their experiences of discrimination, of being treated as less than human because of the color of their skin, their gender, or their background. Slowly but surely, something began to shift within Robert. He started to see the world through different eyes, to understand the impact that his actions and the actions of others like him had on those around him. It was a humbling experience, one that forced him to confront the man he had been and to begin the process of becoming someone better. But the hardest part was yet to come. Reaching out to the passenger he had wronged was something that weighed heavily on Robert's mind. He had put it off for as long as he could, not out of reluctance, but because he wanted to make sure that when he finally did it, he would do it right. He didn't want to offer another hollow apology. He wanted to express something real, something that came from the deepest part of himself. As Robert McAllister left the terminal, his steps felt lighter than they had in a long time. The journey he had embarked on was far from over, but he had taken the first crucial steps toward change. He knew that the road ahead would be challenging, filled with moments of doubt and self-reflection, but he was committed to facing it with the same determination he once reserved for his flights. The skies were vast and unpredictable, much like the journey of personal growth he now found himself on. But for the first time, Robert wasn't afraid to face the turbulence, both in the air and within himself. That's it, everyone. What do you think of Robert's transformation from a man of rigid beliefs to someone willing to confront and change his prejudices? Which part of his journey resonated with you the most? Was it his confrontation with his past, or the way he sought redemption? Share your thoughts in the comment section below. We'd love to hear what you think. And if there's another story of justice, personal growth, or redemption you'd like us to explore next, let us know. Your suggestions and insights help shape the stories we bring to you. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful and thought-provoking stories like this one. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. We've got plenty more tales that challenge societal norms and highlight the resilience of the human spirit. Until next time, keep questioning, keep growing, and never stop seeking the truth.